Chapter 5. As we entered deeper into what had once been the city, the evidences of Manel's past occupancy became more frequent. For a mile from the arch, there was only a riot of weeds and undergrowth and trees covering small mounds and little hillocks that, I was sure, were formed of the ruins of stately buildings of the dead past. But presently we came upon a district where shattered walls still raised their crumbling tops in sad silence above the grass-grown sepulchres of their fallen fellows. Softened and mellowed by ancient ivy stood these sentinels of sorrow, their scarred faces still revealing the rents and gashes of shrapnel and of bomb. Contrary to our expectations, we found little indication that lions in any great numbers laired in this part of ancient London. Well-worn pathways, molded by padded paws, led through the cavernous windows or doorways of a few of the ruins we passed, and once we saw the savage face of a great, black-maned lion scowling down upon us from a shattered stone balcony. We followed down the bank of the Thames after we came upon it. I was anxious to look with my own eyes upon the famous bridge, and I guessed, too, that the river would lead me into the part of London where stood Westminster Abbey and the Tower. Realizing that the section through which we had been passing was doubtless outlying, and therefore not so built up with large structures as the more centrally located part of the old town, I felt sure that farther down the river I should find the ruins larger. The bridge would be there in part, at least, and so would remain the walls of many of the great edifices of the past. There would be no such complete ruin of large structures as I had seen among the smaller buildings. But when I had come to that part of the city, which I judged to have contained the relics, I found havoc that had been wrought there even greater than elsewhere. At one point upon the bosom of the Thames, there rises a few feet above the water a single, disintegrating mound of masonry. Opposite it, upon either bank of the river, are tumbled piles of ruins overgrown with vegetation. These, I am forced to believe, are all that remain of London Bridge, for nowhere else along the river is there any other slightest sign of pier or abutment. Rounding the base of a large pile of grass-covered debris, we came suddenly upon the best preserved ruin we had yet discovered. The entire lower story, and part of the second story of what must once have been a splendid public building, rose from a great knoll of shrubbery and trees, while ivy, thick and luxuriant, clambered upward to the summit of the broken walls. In many places the gray stone was still exposed, its smoothly chiseled face pitted with the scars of battle. The massive portal yawned, somber and sorrowful, before us, giving a glimpse of marble halls within. The temptation to enter was too great. I wished to explore the interior of this one remaining monument of civilization, now dead beyond recall. Through this same portal, within these very marble halls, had Gray and Chamberlain and Kitchener and Shaw, perhaps, come and gone with the other great ones of the past. I took Victorine's hand in mine. "Come," I said. "I do not know the name by which this great pile was known, nor the purposes it fulfilled. It may have been the palace of your sires, Victory. From some great throne within, your forebears may have directed the destinies of half the world. Come." I must confess to a feeling of awe as we entered the rotunda of the great building. Pieces of massive furniture of another day still stood where man had placed them centuries ago. They were littered with dust and broken stone and plaster, but otherwise, so perfect was their preservation, I could hardly believe that 2 centuries had rolled by since human eyes were last set upon them. Through one great room after another we wandered, hand in hand, while Victory asked many questions, and for the first time I began to realize something of the magnificence and power of the race from whose loins she had sprung. Splendid tapestries, now mildewed and rotting, hung upon the walls. There were mural paintings, too, depicting great historic events of the past. For the first time Victory saw the likeness of a horse, and she was much affected by a huge oil which depicted some ancient cavalry charge against a battery of field guns. In other pictures there were steamships, battleships, submarines, and quaint-looking railway trains, all small and antiquated in appearance to me, but wonderful to Victory. She told me that she would like to remain for the rest of her life, where she could look at those pictures daily. From room to room we passed until presently we emerged into a mighty chamber, dark and gloomy, for its high and narrow windows were choked and clogged by ivy. Along one paneled wall we groped, our eyes slowly becoming accustomed to the darkness. A rank and pungent odor pervaded the atmosphere. We had made our way about half the distance across one end of the great apartment when a low growl from the far end brought us to a startled halt. Straining my eyes through the gloom, I made out a raised dais at the extreme opposite end of the hall. Upon the dais stood two great chairs, high-backed and with great arms. The throne of England. But what were those strange forms about it? Victory gave my hand a quick, excited little squeeze. "The lions," she whispered. Yes, lions indeed. Sprawled about the dais were a dozen huge forms, while upon the seat of one of the thrones, a small cub lay curled in slumber. As we stood there for a moment, spellbound by the sight of those fearsome creatures occupying the very thrones of the sovereigns of England, the low growl was repeated, and a great male rose slowly to his feet. His devilish eyes bored straight through the semi-darkness toward us. He had discovered the interloper. What right had man within this palace of the beasts? Again he opened his giant jaws, and this time there rumbled forth a warning roar. Instantly, 8 or 10 of the other beasts leaped to their feet. Already the great fellow who had spied us was advancing slowly in our direction. I held my rifle ready, but how futile it appeared in the face of this savage horde. The foremost beast broke into a slow trot, and at his heels came the others. All were roaring now, and the din of their great voices reverberating through the halls and corridors of the palace formed the most frightful chorus of thunderous savagery imaginable to the mind of man. And then the leader charged, and upon the hideous pandemonium broke the sharp crack of my rifle, once, twice, thrice. 3 lions rolled, struggling and biting, to the floor. Victory seized my arm with a quick, "This way. Here is a door," and a moment later we were in a tiny antechamber at the foot of a narrow stone staircase. Up this we backed, Victory just behind me, as the first of the remaining lions leaped from the throne room and sprang for the stairs. Again I fired, but others of the ferocious beasts leaped over their fallen fellows and pursued us. The stairs were very narrow. That was all that saved us, for as I backed slowly upward, but a single lion could attack me at a time, and the carcasses of those I slew impeded the rushes of the others. At last we reached the top. There was a long corridor from which opened many doorways. One directly behind us was tight closed. If we could open it and pass into the chamber behind, we might find a respite from attack. The remaining lions were roaring horribly. I saw one sneaking very slowly up the stairs toward us. "Try that door," I called to Victory. "See if it will open." She ran up to it and pushed. "Turn the knob," I cried, seeing that she did not know how to open a door, but neither did she know what I meant by knob. I put a bullet in the spine of the approaching lion and leaped to Victoriel's side. The door resisted my first efforts to swing it inward. Rusted hinges and swollen wood held it tightly closed. But at last it gave, and just as another lion mounted to the top of the stairway, it swung in, and I pushed Victory across the threshold. Then I turned to meet the renewed attack of the savage foe. One lion fell in his tracks, another stumbled to my very feet, and then I leaped within and slammed the portal to. A quick glance showed me that this was the only door to the small apartment in which we had found sanctuary, and, with a sigh of relief, I leaned for a moment against the panels of the stout barrier that separated us from the ramping demons without. Across the room, between 2 windows, stood a flat-topped desk. A little pile of white and brown lay upon it close to the opposite edge. After a moment of rest, I crossed the room to investigate. The white was the bleached human bones, the skull, collar bones, arms, and a few of the upper ribs of a man. The brown was the dust of a decayed military cap and blouse. In a chair before the desk were other bones, while more still strewed the floor beneath the desk and about the chair. A man had died sitting there with his face buried in his arms 200 years ago. Beneath the desk were a pair of spurred military boots, green and rotten with decay. In them were the leg bones of a man. Among the tiny bones of the hands was an ancient fountain pen, as good, apparently, as the day it was made, and a metal-covered memoranda book closed over the bones of an index finger. It was a gruesome sight, a pitiful sight this lone inhabitant of mighty London. I picked up the metal-covered memoranda book. Its pages were rotten and stuck together. Only here and there was a sentence or a part of a sentence legible. The first that I could read was near the middle of the little volume. His Majesty left for Tunbridge Wells today, he. Jesty was stricken. Turde. God give she does not die. Am military governor of Lawn. And farther on. It is awful. 100 deaths today. Worse than the bombardum. Near the end, I picked out the following. I promised his Madge. He will find me here when he ret. Alone. The most legible passage was on the next page. Thank God we drove them out. There is not a single man on British soil today, but at what awful cost. I tried to persuade Sir Philip to urge the people to remain. But they are mad with fear of the death and rage at our enemies. He tells me that the coast cities are packed, waiting to be taken across. What will become of England, with none left to rebuild her shattered cities? And the last entry. Alone. Only the wild beasts. A lion is roaring now, beneath the palace windows. I think the people feared the beasts even more than they did the death. But they are gone, all gone, and to what? How much better conditions will they find on the continent? All gone, only I remained. I promised his Majesty, and when he returns he will find that I was true to my trust, for I shall be awaiting him. God save the king. That was all. This brave and forever nameless officer died nobly at his post, true to his country and his king. It was the death, no doubt, that took him. Some of the entries had been dated. From the few legible letters and figures which remained, I judged the end came sometime in August 1937, but of that I am not at all certain. The diary has cleared up at least one mystery that had puzzled me not a little, and now I am surprised that I had not guessed its solution myself: the presence of African and Asiatic beasts in England. Acclimated by years of confinement in the zoological gardens, they were fitted to resume in England the wild existence for which nature had intended them, and once free, had evidently bred prolifically, in marked contrast to the captive exotics of 20th-century Pan America, which had gradually become fewer until extinction occurred sometime during the 21st century. The palace, if such it was, lay not far from the banks of the Thames. The room in which we were imprisoned overlooked the river, and I determined to attempt to escape in this direction. To descend through the palace was out of the question, but outside we could discover no lions. The stems of the ivy which clambered upward past the window of the room were as large around as my arm. I knew that they would support our weight, and as we could gain nothing by remaining longer in the palace, I decided to descend by way of the ivy and follow along down the river in the direction of the launch. Naturally, I was much handicapped by the presence of the girl. But I could not abandon her, though I had no idea what I should do with her after rejoining my companions. That she would prove a burden and an embarrassment I was certain, but she had made it equally plain to me that she would never return to her people to mate with Buckingham. I owed my life to her, and, all other considerations aside, that was sufficient demand upon my gratitude and my honor to necessitate my suffering every inconvenience in her service. 2. She was Queen of England. But by far the most potent argument in her favor, she was a woman in distress, and a young and very beautiful one. And so, though I wished 1,000 times that she was back in her camp, I never let her guess it, but did all that lay within my power to serve and protect her. I thank God now that I did so. With the lions still padding back and forth beyond the closed door, victory, and I crossed the room to one of the windows. I had outlined my plan to her, and she had assured me that she could descend the ivy without assistance. In fact, she smiled a trifle at my question. Swinging myself outward, I began the descent, and had come to within a few feet of the ground, being just opposite a narrow window, when I was startled by a savage growl almost in my ear, and then a great taloned paw darted from the aperture to seize me, and I saw the snarling face of a lion within the embrasure. Releasing my hold upon the ivy, I dropped the remaining distance to the ground, saved from laceration only because the lionel's paw struck the thick stem of ivy. The creature was making a frightful racket now, leaping back and forth from the floor at the broad window ledge, tearing at the masonry with his claws in vain attempts to reach me. But the opening was too narrow, and the masonry too solid. Victory had commenced the descent, but I called to her to stop just above the window, and, as the lion reappeared, growling and snarling, I put a .33 bullet in his face. And at the same moment, Victory slipped quickly past him, dropping into my upraised arms that were awaiting her. The roaring of the beasts that had discovered us, together with the report of my rifle, had set the balance of the fierce inmates of the palace into the most frightful uproar I have ever heard. I feared that it would not be long before intelligence or instinct would draw them from the interiors and set them upon our trail, the river. Nor had we much more than reached it when a lion bounded around the corner of the edifice we had just quitted and stood looking about as though in search of us. Following came others, while Victory and I crouched in hiding behind a clump of bushes close to the bank of the river. The beasts sniffed about the ground for a while, but they did not chance to go near the spot where we had stood beneath the window that had given us escape. Presently a black-maned male raised his head, and with cocked ears and glaring eyes, gazed straight at the bush behind which we lay. I could have sworn that he had discovered us, and when he took a few short and stately steps in our direction, I raised my rifle and covered him. But after a long, tense moment he looked away, and turned to glare in another direction. I breathed a sigh of relief, and so did Victory. I could feel her body quiver as she lay pressed close to me, our cheeks almost touching as we both peered through the same small opening in the foliage. I turned to give her a reassuring smile as the lion indicated that he had not seen us, and as I did so she, too, turned her face toward mine for the same purpose, doubtless. Anyway, as our heads turned simultaneously, our lips brushed together. A startled expression came into Victoria's eyes as she drew back in evident confusion. As for me, the strangest sensation that I have ever experienced claimed me for an instant. A peculiar tingling thrill ran through my veins, and my head swam. I could not account for it. Naturally, being a naval officer and consequently in the best society of the Federation, I have seen much of women. With others, I have laughed at the assertions of the savants that modern man is a cold and passionless creation in comparison with the males of former ages. In a word, that love, as the one grand passion, had ceased to exist. I do not know now, but that they were more nearly right than we have guessed, at least in so far as modern civilized woman is concerned. I have kissed many women, young and beautiful and middle-aged and old, and many that I had no business kissing. But never before had I experienced that remarkable and altogether delightful thrill that followed the accidental brushing of my lips against the lips of Victory. The occurrence interested me, and I was tempted to experiment further. But when I would have essayed it, another new and entirely unaccountable force restrained me. For the first time in my life, I felt embarrassment in the presence of a woman. What further might have developed I cannot say, for at that moment a perfect she-devil of a lioness, with keener eyes than her lord and master, discovered us. She came trotting toward our place of concealment, growling and baring her yellow fangs. I waited for an instant, hoping that I might be mistaken, and that she would turn off in some other direction. But no, she increased her trot to a gallop, and then I fired at her, but the bullet, though it struck her full in the breast, didn't stop her. Screaming with pain and rage, the creature fairly flew toward us. Behind her came other lions. Our case looked hopeless. We were upon the brink of the river. There seemed no avenue of escape, and I knew that even my modern automatic rifle was inadequate in the face of so many of these fierce beasts. To remain where we were would have been suicidal. We were both standing now, Victory keeping her place bravely at my side, when I reached the only decision open to me. Seizing the girl's hand, I turned, just as the lioness crashed into the opposite side of the bushes, and, dragging Victory after me, leaped over the edge of the bank into the river. I did not know that lions are not fond of water, nor did I know if Victory could swim, but death, immediate and terrible, stared us in the face if we remained, and so I took the chance. At this point the current ran close to the shore, so that we were immediately in deep water, and, to my intense satisfaction, Victory struck out with a strong, overhand stroke and set all my fears on her account at rest. But my relief was short-lived. That lioness, as I have said before, was a veritable devil. She stood for a moment glaring at us. Then like a shot, she sprang into the river and swam swiftly after us. Victory was a length ahead of me. "Swim for the other shore," I called to her. I was much impeded by my rifle, having to swim with one hand while clung to my precious weapon with the other. The girl had seen the lioness take to the water, and she had also seen that I was swimming much more slowly than she, and what did she do? She started to drop back to my side. "Go on," I cried. "Make for the other shore, and then follow down until you find my friends. Tell them that I sent you, and with orders that they are to protect you. Go on. Go on." But she only waited until we were again swimming side by side, and I saw that she had drawn her long knife and was holding it between her teeth. "Do as I tell you," I said to her sharply, but she shook her head. The lioness was overhauling us rapidly. She was swimming silently, her chin just touching the water, but blood was streaming from between her lips. It was evident that her lungs were pierced. She was almost upon me. I saw that in a moment she would take me under her forepaws or seize me in those great jaws. I felt that my time had come, but I meant to die fighting. And so I turned and, treading water, raised my rifle above my head and awaited her. Victory, animated by a bravery no less ferocious than that of the dumb beast assailing us, swam straight for me. It all happened so swiftly that I cannot recall the details of the kaleidoscopic action which ensued. I knew that I rose high out of the water, and, with clubbed rifle, dealt the animal a terrific blow upon the skull, that I saw Victory, her long blade flashing in her hand, close, striking, upon the beast, that a great paw fell upon her shoulder, and that I was swept beneath the surface of the water like a straw before the prow of a freighter. Still clinging to my rifle, I rose again, to see the lioness struggling in her death throes but an arm's length from me. Scarcely had I risen than the beast turned upon her side, struggled frantically for an instant, and then sank. Chapter 6. Victory was nowhere in sight. Alone, I floated upon the bosom of the Thames. In that brief instant, I believe that I suffered more mental anguish than I have crowded into all the balance of my life before or since. A few hours before, I had been wishing that I might be rid of her, and now that she was gone, I would have given my life to have her back again. Wearily, I turned to swim about the spot where she had disappeared, hoping that she might rise once at least, and I would be given the opportunity to save her. And, as I turned, the water boiled before my face and her head shot up before me. I was on the point of striking out to seize her, when a happy smile illumined her features. "You are not dead," she cried. "I have been searching the bottom for you. I was sure that the blow she gave you must have disabled you," and she glanced about for the lioness. "She is gone?" she asked. "Dead," I replied. "The blow you struck her with the thing you call rifle stunned her," she explained, and then I swam in close enough to get my knife into her heart. Ah, such a girl. I could not but wonder what one of our own Pan-American women would have done under like circumstances. But then, of course, they have not been trained by stern necessity to cope with the emergencies and dangers of savage primeval life. Along the bank we had just quitted, a score of lions paced to and fro, growling menacingly. We could not return, and we struck out for the opposite shore. I am a strong swimmer and had no doubt as to my ability to cross the river, but I was not so sure about Victory, so I swam close behind her, to be ready to give her assistance should she need it. She did not, however, reaching the opposite bank as fresh, apparently, as when she entered the water. Victory is a wonder. Each day that we were together brought new proofs of it. Nor was it her courage or vitality only which amazed me. She had a head on those shapely shoulders of hers, and dignity. But she could be regal when she chose. She told me that the lions were fewer upon this side of the river, but that there were many wolves, running in great packs later in the year. Now they were north somewhere, and we should have little to fear from them, though we might meet with a few. My first concern was to take my weapons apart and dry them, which was rather difficult in the face of the fact that every rag about me was drenched. But finally, Thanks to the sun and much rubbing, I succeeded, though I had no oil to lubricate them. We ate some wild berries and roots that Victory found, and then we set off again down the river, keeping an eye open for game on one side and the launch on the other. For I thought that Delcart, who would be the natural leader during my absence, might run up the Thames in search of me. The balance of that day we sought in vain for game or for the launch, and when night came we lay down, our stomachs empty, to sleep beneath the stars. We were entirely unprotected from attack from wild beasts, and for this reason I remained awake most of the night, on guard. But nothing approached us, though I could hear the lions roaring across the river, and once I thought I heard the howl of a beast north of us. It might have been a wolf. Altogether, it was a most unpleasant night, and I determined then that if we were forced to sleep out again, that I should provide some sort of shelter which would protect us from attack while we slept. Toward morning I dozed, and the sun was well up when Victory aroused me by gently shaking my shoulder. "Antelope," she whispered in my ear, and, as I raised my head, she pointed upriver. Crawling to my knees, I looked in the direction she indicated, to see a buck standing upon a little knoll some 200 yards from us. There was good cover between the animal and me, and so, though I might have hit him at 200 yards, I preferred to crawl closer to him and make sure of the meat we both so craved. I had covered about 50 yards of the distance, and the beast was still feeding peacefully, so I thought that I would make even surer of a hit by going ahead another 50 yards, when the animal suddenly raised his head and looked away, upriver. His whole attitude proclaimed that he was startled by something beyond him that I could not see. Realizing that he might break and run, and that I should then probably miss him entirely, I raised my rifle to my shoulder. But even as I did so, the animal leaped into the air, and simultaneously there was a sound of a shot from beyond the knoll. For an instant I was dumbfounded. Had the report come from downriver, I should have instantly thought that one of my own men had fired. But coming from upriver, it puzzled me considerably. Who could there be with firearms in primitive England other than we of the Coldwater? Victory was directly behind me, and I motioned for her to lie down, as I did, behind the bush from which I had been upon the point of firing at the antelope. We could see that the buck was quite dead, and from our hiding place we waited to discover the identity of his slayer when the latter should approach and claim his kill. We had not long to wait, and when I saw the head and shoulders of a man appear above the crest of the knoll, I sprang to my feet with a heartfelt cry of joy, for it was Delcart. At the sound of my voice, Delcart half raised his rifle in readiness for the attack of an enemy, but a moment later he recognized me and was coming rapidly to meet us. Behind him was Snyder. They both were astounded to see me upon the north bank of the river, and much more so at the sight of my companion. Then I introduced them to Victory, and told them that she was Queen of England. They thought at first that I was joking. But when I had recounted my adventures, and they realized that I was in earnest, they believed me. They told me that they had followed me inshore when I had not returned from the hunt, that they had met the men of the Elephant Country, and had had a short and one-sided battle with the fellows. And that afterward they had returned to the launch with a prisoner, from whom they had learned that I had probably been captured by the men of the Lion Country. With the prisoner as a guide they had set off upriver in search of me, but had been much delayed by motor trouble, and had finally camped after dark a half-mile above the spot where Victory and I had spent the night. They must have passed us in the dark, and why I did not hear the sound of the propeller I do not know, unless it passed me at a time when the lions were making an unusually ear-splitting din upon the opposite side. Taking the antelope with us, we all returned to the launch, where we found Taylor as delighted to see me alive again as Delcart had been. Cannot say truthfully that Snyder evinced much enthusiasm at my rescue. Taylor had found the ingredients for chemical fuel, and the distilling of them had, with the motor trouble, accounted for their delay in setting out after me. The prisoner that Delcart and Snyder had taken was a powerful young fellow from the Elephant Country. Notwithstanding the fact that they had all assured him to the contrary, he still could not believe that we would not kill him. He assured us that his name was 36, and, as he could not count above 10, I am sure that he had no conception of the correct meaning of the word, and that it may have been handed down to him either from the military number of an ancestor who had served in the English ranks during the Great War, or that originally it was the number of some famous regiment with which a forbear fought. Now that we were reunited, we held a council to determine what course we should pursue in the immediate future. Snyder was still for setting out to sea and returning to Pan America, but the better judgment of Delcart and Taylor ridiculed the suggestion. We should not have lived a fortnight. To remain in England, constantly menaced by wild beasts and men equally as wild, seemed about as bad. I suggested that we cross the Channel and ascertain if we could not discover a more enlightened and civilized people upon the continent. I was sure that some trace of the ancient culture and greatness of Europe must remain. Germany, probably, would be much as it was during the 20th century, for, in common with most Pan Americans, I was positive that Germany had been victorious in the Great War. Snyder demurred at the suggestion. He said that it was bad enough to have come this far. He did not want to make it worse by going to the continent. The outcome of it was that I finally lost my patience and told him that from then on he would do what I thought best, that I proposed to assume command of the party, and that they might all consider themselves under my orders, as much so as though we were still aboard the Coldwater and in Pan-American waters. Delcart and Taylor immediately assured me that they had not for an instant assumed anything different, and that they were as ready to follow and obey me here as they would be upon the other side of 30. Snyder said nothing, but he wore a sullen scowl. And I wished then, as I had before, and as I did to a much greater extent later, that fate had not decreed that he should have chanced to be a member of the Launchel's party upon that memorable day when last we quitted the Coldwater. Victory, who was given a voice in our councils, was all for going to the continent, or anywhere else, in fact, where she might see new sights and experience new adventures. Afterward we can come back to Grabberton, she said, and if Buckingham is not dead and we can catch him away from his men and kill him, then can return to my people, and we can all live in peace and happiness. She spoke of killing Buckingham with no greater concern than one might evince in the contemplated destruction of a sheep. Yet she was neither cruel nor vindictive. In fact, Victory is a very sweet and womanly woman. But human life is of small account beyond 30, a legacy from the bloody days when thousands of men perished in the trenches between the rising and the setting of a sun, when they laid them lengthwise in these same trenches and sprinkled dirt over them, when the Germans corded their corpses like wood and set fire to them, when women and children and old men were butchered, and great passenger ships were torpedoed without warning. 36, finally assured that we did not intend slaying him, was as keen to accompany us as was Victory. The crossing to the continent was uneventful, its monotony being relieved, however, by the childish delight of Victory and 36 in the novel experience of riding safely upon the bosom of the water, and of being so far from land. With the possible exception of Snyder, the little party appeared in the best of spirits, laughing and joking, or interestedly discussing the possibilities which the future held for us, what we should find upon the continent, and whether the inhabitants would be civilized or barbarian peoples. Victory asked me to explain the difference between the two, and when I had tried to do so as clearly as possible, she broke into a gay little laugh. "Oh," she cried, "then I am a barbarian." I could not but laugh too, as I admitted that she was indeed a barbarian. She was not offended, taking the matter as a huge joke. But some time thereafter she sat in silence, apparently deep in thought. Finally she looked up at me, her strong white teeth gleaming behind her smiling lips. "Should you take that thing you call razor," she said, "and cut the hair from the face of 36, and exchange garments with him, you would be the barbarian and 36 the civilized man. There is no other difference between you, except your weapons. Clothe you in a wolfskin, give you a knife and a spear, and set you down in the woods of Grabberton. Of what service would your civilization be to you?" Delcart and Taylor smiled at her reply, but 36 and Snyder laughed uproariously. I was not surprised at 36, but I thought that Snyder laughed louder than the occasion warranted. As a matter of fact, Snyder, it seemed to me, was taking advantage of every opportunity, however slight, to show insubordination, And I determined then that at the first real breach of discipline, I should take action that would remind Snyder, ever after, that I was still his commanding officer. I could not help but notice that his eyes were much upon victory, and I did not like it, for I knew the type of man he was. But as it would not be necessary ever to leave the girl alone with him, I felt no apprehension for her safety. After the incident of the discussion of barbarians, I thought that Victoriel's manner toward me changed perceptibly. She held aloof from me, and when Snyder took his turn at the wheel, sat beside him, upon the pretext that she wished to learn how to steer the launch. I wondered if she had guessed the Manel's antipathy for me, and was seeking his company solely for the purpose of piquing me. Snyder was, too, taking full advantage of his opportunity. Often he leaned toward the girl to whisper in her ear, and he laughed much, which was unusual with Snyder. Of course, it was nothing at all to me. Yet, for some unaccountable reason, the sight of the two of them sitting there so close to one another and seeming to be enjoying each other's society to such a degree irritated me tremendously, and put me in such a bad humor that I took no pleasure whatsoever in the last few hours of the crossing. We aimed to land near the site of ancient Ostend. But when we neared the coast, we discovered no indication of any human habitations whatever, let alone a city. After we had landed, we found the same howling wilderness about us that we had discovered on the British Isle. There was no slightest indication that civilized man had ever set a foot upon that portion of the continent of Europe. Although I had feared as much, since our experience in England, I could not but own to a feeling of marked disappointment, and to the gravest fears of the future, which induced a mental depression that was in no way dissipated by the continued familiarity between Victory and Snyder. I was angry with myself that I permitted that matter to affect me as it had. I did not wish to admit to myself that I was angry with this uncultured little savage, that it made the slightest difference to me what she did or what she did not do, or that I could so lower myself as to feel personal enmity towards a common sailor. And yet, to be honest, I was doing both. Finding nothing to detain us about the spot where Ostend once had stood, we set out up the coast in search of the mouth of the river Rhine, which I purposed ascending in search of civilized man. It was my intention to explore the Rhine as far up as the launch would take us. If we found no civilization there, we would return to the North Sea, continue up the coast to the Elbe, and follow that river and the canals of Berlin. Here, at least, I was sure that we should find what we sought, and if not, then all Europe had reverted to barbarism. The weather remained fine, and we made excellent progress, but everywhere along the Rhine we met with the same disappointment. No sign of civilized man, in fact, no sign of man at all. I was not enjoying the exploration of modern Europe as I had anticipated. I was unhappy. Victory seemed changed, too. I had enjoyed her company at first, but since the trip across the Channel, I had held aloof from her. Her chin was in the air most of the time, and yet I rather think that she regretted her friendliness with Snyder, for I noticed that she avoided him entirely. He, on the contrary, emboldened by her former friendliness, sought every opportunity to be near her. I should have liked nothing better than a reasonably good excuse to punch his head. Yet, paradoxically, I was ashamed of myself for harboring him any ill will. I realized that there was something the matter with me, but I did not know what it was. Matters remained thus for several days, and we continued our journey up the Rhine. At Cologne, I had hoped to find some reassuring indications, but there was no Cologne. And as there had been no other cities along the river up to that point, the devastation was infinitely greater than time alone could have wrought. Great guns, bombs, and mines must have leveled every building that man had raised, and then nature, unhindered, had covered the ghastly evidence of human depravity with her beauteous mantle of verdure. Splendid trees reared their stately tops where splendid cathedrals once had reared their domes, and sweet wild flowers blossomed in simple serenity in soil that once was drenched with human blood. Nature had reclaimed what man had once stolen from her and defiled. A herd of zebras grazed where once the German Kaiser may have reviewed his troops. An antelope rested peacefully in a bed of daisies where, perhaps, 200 years ago a big gun belched its terror-laden messages of death, of hate, of destruction against the works of man and God alike. We were in need of fresh meat, yet I hesitated to shatter the quiet and peaceful serenity of the view with the crack of a rifle and the death of one of those beautiful creatures before us. But it had to be done. We must eat. I left the work to Delcart, however, and in a moment we had 2 antelope and the landscape to ourselves. After eating, we boarded the launch and continued up the river. For 2 days, we passed through a primeval wilderness. In the afternoon of the second day, we landed upon the west bank of the river, and, leaving Snyder and 36 to guard Victory and the launch, Delcart Taylor, and I set out after game. We tramped away from the river for upwards of an hour before discovering anything, and then only a small red deer, which Taylor brought down with a neat shot of 200 yards. It was getting too late to proceed farther, so we rigged a sling, and the 2 men carried the deer back toward the launch while I walked 100 yards ahead, in the hope of bagging something further for our larder. We had covered about half the distance to the river when I suddenly came face to face with a man. He was as primitive and uncouth in appearance as the Grabbertins, a shaggy, unkempt savage, clothed in a shirt of skin cured with the head on, the latter surmounting his own head to form a bonnet, and giving to him a most fearful and ferocious aspect. The fellow was armed with a long spear and a club, the latter dangling down his back from a leathern thong about his neck. His feet were encased in hide sandals. At sight of me, he halted for an instant, then turned and dove into the forest, and though I called reassuringly to him in English, he did not return, nor did I again see him. The sight of the wild man raised my hopes once more that elsewhere we might find men in a higher state of civilization. It was the society of civilized man that I craved, and so, with a lighter heart, I continued on toward the river and the launch. I was still some distance ahead of Delcart and Taylor when I came in sight of the Rhine again. But I came to the water's edge before I noticed that anything was amiss with the party we had left there a few hours before. My first intimation of disaster was the absence of the launch from its former moorings. And then, a moment later, I discovered the body of a man lying upon the bank. Running toward it, I saw that it was 36, and as I stopped and raised the Grabbertinal's head in my arms, I heard a faint moan break from his lips. He was not dead, but that he was badly injured was all too evident. Delcart and Taylor came up a moment later, and the 3 of us worked over the fellow, hoping to revive him that he might tell us what had happened and what had become of the others. My first thought was prompted by the sight I had recently had of the savage native. The little party had evidently been surprised, and in the attack 36 had been wounded and the others taken prisoners. The thought was almost like a physical blow in the face. It stunned me. Victory in the hands of these abysmal brutes. It was frightful. I almost shook poor 36 in my efforts to revive him. I explained my theory to the others, and then Delcart shattered it by a single movement of the hand. He drew aside the lionel's skin that covered half of the Grabbertinal's breast, revealing a neat, round hole in 36's chest, a hole that could have been made by no other weapon than a rifle. "Snyder," I exclaimed. Delcart nodded. At about the same time, the eyelids of the wounded man fluttered and raised. He looked up at us, and very slowly the light of consciousness returned to his eyes. "What happened, 36?" I asked him. He tried to reply, but the effort caused him to cough, bringing about a hemorrhage of the lungs, and again he fell back exhausted. For several long minutes he lay as one dead. Then in an almost inaudible whisper he spoke. "Snyder," he paused, tried to speak again, raised a hand, and pointed downriver. They went back, and then he shuddered convulsively and died. None of us voiced his belief. But I think they were all alike. Victory and Snyder had stolen the launch and deserted us. Chapter 7. We stood there, grouped about the body of the dead Grabbertin, looking futilely down the river to where it made an abrupt curve to the west, a quarter of a mile below us, and was lost to sight, as though we expected to see the truant returning to us with our precious launch, the thing that meant life or death to us in this unfriendly, savage world. I felt, rather than saw, Taylor turn his eyes slowly toward my profile, and, as mine swung to meet them, the expression upon his face recalled me to my duty and responsibility as an officer. The utter hopelessness that was reflected in his face must have been the counterpart of what I myself felt. But in that brief instant, I determined to hide my own misgivings that I might bolster up the courage of the others. "We are lost," was written as plainly upon Taylor's face as though his features were the printed words upon an open book. He was thinking of the launch, and of the launch alone. Was I? I tried to think that I was. But a greater grief than the loss of the launch could have engendered in me filled my heart, a sullen, gnawing misery which I tried to deny, which I refused to admit, but which persisted in obsessing me until my heart rose and filled my throat, and I could not speak when I would have uttered words of reassurance to my companions. And then rage came to my relief. Rage against the vile traitor who had deserted 3 of his fellow countrymen in so frightful a position. Tried to feel an equal rage against the woman, but somehow I could not, and kept searching for excuses for her youth, her inexperience, her savagery. My rising anger swept away my temporary helplessness. I smiled and told Taylor not to look so glum. "We will follow them," I said, "and the chances are that we shall overtake them. They will not travel as rapidly as Snyder probably hopes. He will be forced to halt for fuel and for food, and the launch must follow the windings of the river. We can take short cuts while they are traversing the detour. I have my map, thank God. I always carry it upon my person, and with that and the compass we will have an advantage over them." My words seemed to cheer them both, and they were for starting off at once in pursuit. There was no reason why we should delay, and we set forth down the river. As we tramped along, we discussed a question that was uppermost in the mind of each: what we should do with Snyder when we had captured him. For with the action of pursuit had come the optimistic conviction that we should succeed. As a matter of fact, we had to succeed. The very thought of remaining in this utter wilderness for the rest of our lives was impossible. We arrived at nothing very definite in the matter of Snyder's punishment, since Taylor was for shooting him, Delcart insisting that he should be hanged, while I, although fully conscious of the gravity of his offense, could not bring myself to give the death penalty. I fell to wondering what charm victory had found in such a man as Snyder, and why I insisted upon finding excuses for her and trying to defend her indefensible act. She was nothing to me. Aside from the natural gratitude I felt for her since she had saved my life, I owed her nothing. She was a half-naked little savage, I, a gentleman and an officer in the world's greatest navy. There could be no close bonds of interest between us. This line of reflection I discovered to be as distressing as the former, but though I tried to turn my mind to other things, it persisted in returning to the vision of an oval face, sun-tanned, of smiling lips revealing white and even teeth, of brave eyes that harbored no shadow of guile, and of a tumbling mass of wavy hair that crowned the loveliest picture on which my eyes had ever rested. Every time this vision presented itself, I felt myself turn cold with rage and hate against Snyder. I could forgive the launch, but if he had wronged her, he should die at my own hands. In this I was determined. For 2 days we followed the river northward, cutting off where we could, but confined for the most part to the game trails that paralleled the stream. One afternoon, we cut across a narrow neck of land that saved us many miles, where the river wound to the west and back again. Here we decided to halt, for we had had a hard day of it, and, if the truth were known, I think that we had all given up hope of overtaking the launch other than by the merest accident. We had shot a deer just before our halt, and, as Taylor and Delcart were preparing it, I walked down to the water to fill our canteens. I had just finished, and was straightening up, when something floating around a bend above me caught my eye. For a moment, I could not believe the testimony of my own senses. It was a boat. I shouted to Delcart and Taylor, who came running to my side. "The launch," cried Delcart, and indeed it was the launch floating downriver from above us. Where had it been? How had we passed it? And how were we to reach it now, should Snyder and the girl discover us? "It'll's drifting," said Taylor. "I see no one in it." I was stripping off my clothes, and Delcart soon followed my example. I told Taylor to remain on shore with the clothing and rifles. He might also serve us better there, since it would give him an opportunity to take a shot at Snyder, should the man discover us and show himself. With powerful strokes, we swam out in the path of the oncoming launch. Being a stronger swimmer than Delcart, I soon was far in the lead, reaching the center of the channel just as the launch bore down upon me. It was drifting broadside on. I seized the gunwale and raised myself quickly, so that my chin topped the side. I expected a blow the moment that I came within the view of the occupants, but no blow fell. Snyder lay upon his back in the bottom of the boat alone. Even before I had clambered in and stooped above him, I knew that he was dead. Without examining him further, I ran forward to the control board and pressed the starting button. To my relief, the mechanism responded. The launch was uninjured. Coming about, I picked up Delcart. He was astounded at the sight that met his eyes, and immediately fell to examining Snyder's body for signs of life or an explanation of the manner in which he met his death. The fellow had been dead for hours. He was cold and still. But Delcart's search was not without results, for above Snyder's heart was a wound, a slit about an inch in length, such a slit as a sharp knife would make, and in the dead fingers of one hand was clutched a strand of long brown hair. Victoriel's hair was brown. They say that dead men tell no tales, but Snyder told the story of his end as clearly as though the dead lips had parted and poured forth the truth. The beast had attacked the girl, and she had defended her honor. We buried Snyder beside the Rhine, and no stone marks his last resting place. Beasts do not require headstones. Then we set out in the launch, turning her nose upstream. When I had told Delcart and Taylor that I intended searching for the girl, neither had demurred. "We had her wrong in our thoughts," said Delcart, "and the least that we can do in expiation is to find and rescue her." We called her name aloud every few minutes as we motored up the river, but though we returned all the way to our former camping place, we did not find her. I then decided to retrace our journey, letting Taylor handle the launch, while Delcart and I, upon opposite sides of the river, searched for some sign of the spot where Victory had landed. We found nothing until we had reached a point a few miles above the spot where I had first seen the launch drifting down toward us, and there I discovered the remnants of a recent campfire. That Victory carried flint and steel I was aware, and that it was she who built the fire I was positive. But which way had she gone since she stopped here? Would she go on down the river, that she might thus bring herself nearer her own Grabritin, or would she have sought to search for us upstream, where she had seen us last? I had hailed Taylor and sent him across the river to take in Delcart, that the two might join me and discuss my discovery and our future plans. While waiting for them, I stood looking out over the river, my back toward the woods that stretched away to the east behind me. Delcart was just stepping into the launch upon the opposite side of the stream, when, without the least warning, I was violently seized by both arms and about the waist. 3 or 4 men were upon me at once. My rifle was snatched from my hands and my revolver from my belt. I struggled for an instant, but finding my efforts of no avail, I ceased them and turned my head to have a look at my assailants. At the same time, several others of them walked around in front of me, and to my astonishment, I found myself looking upon uniformed soldiery, armed with rifles, revolvers, and sabers, but with faces as black as coal. Chapter 8. Delcart and Taylor were now in midstream, coming toward us, and I called to them to keep aloof until I knew whether the intentions of my captors were friendly or otherwise. My good men wanted to come on and annihilate the blacks, but there were upward of 100 of the latter, all well armed, and so I commanded Delcart to keep out of Harmel's way and stay where he was till I needed him. A young officer called and beckoned to them, but they refused to come, and so he gave orders that resulted in my hands being secured at my back, after which the company marched away, straight toward the east. I noticed that the men wore spurs, which seemed strange to me. But when, late in the afternoon, we arrived at their encampment, I discovered that my captors were cavalrymen. In the center of a plain stood a log fort, with a blockhouse at each of its 4 corners. As we approached, I saw a herd of cavalry horses grazing under guard outside the walls of the post. They were small, stocky horses, but the telltale saddle galls proclaimed their calling. The flag flying from a tall staff inside the palisade was one which I had never before seen nor heard of. We marched directly into the compound, where the company was dismissed, with the exception of a guard of 4 privates, who escorted me in the wake of the young officer. The latter led us across a small parade ground, where a battery of light field guns was parked, and toward a log building, in front of which rose the flagstaff. I was escorted within the building into the presence of an old Negro, a fine-looking man with a dignified and military bearing. He was a colonel, I was to learn later, and to him I owe the very humane treatment that was accorded me while I remained his prisoner. He listened to the report of his junior, and then turned to question me, but with no better results than the former had accomplished. Then he summoned an orderly and gave some instructions. The soldier saluted and left the room, returning in about 5 minutes with a hairy old white man. Just such a savage, primeval-looking fellow as I had discovered in the woods the day that Snyder had disappeared with the launch. The colonel evidently expected to use the fellow as interpreter, but when the savage addressed me, it was in a language as foreign to me as was that of the blacks. At last the old officer gave it up, and shaking his head, gave instructions for my removal. From his office I was led to a guardhouse, in which I found about 50 half-naked whites, clad in the skins of wild beasts. I tried to converse with them, but not one of them could understand Pan-American, nor could I make head or tail of their jargon. For over a month I remained a prisoner there, working from morning until night at odd jobs about the headquarters building of the commanding officer. The other prisoners worked harder than I did, and I owe my better treatment solely to the kindliness and discrimination of the old colonel. What had become of Victory, of Delcart, of Taylor I could not know, nor did it seem likely that I should ever learn. I was most depressed, but I whiled away my time in performing the duties given me to the best of my ability and attempting to learn the language of my captors. Who they were or where they came from was a mystery to me. That they were the outpost of some powerful black nation seemed likely, yet where the seat of that nation lay, I could not guess. They looked upon the whites as their inferiors and treated us accordingly. They had a literature of their own, and many of the men, even the common soldiers, were omnivorous readers. Every 2 weeks a dust-covered trooper would trot his jaded mount into the post and deliver a bulging sack of mail at headquarters. The next day he would be away again upon a fresh horse toward the south, carrying the soldiers' letters to friends in the far-off land of mystery, from whence they all had come. Troops, sometimes mounted and sometimes afoot, left the post daily for what I assumed to be patrol duty. I judged the little force of 1,000 men were detailed here to maintain the authority of a distant government in a conquered country. Later, I learned that my surmise was correct, and this was but one of a great chain of similar posts that dotted the new frontier of the black nation into whose hands I had fallen. Slowly I learned their tongue, so that I could understand what was said before me and make myself understood. I had seen from the first that I was being treated as a slave, that all whites that fell into the hands of the blacks were thus treated. Almost daily new prisoners were brought in, and about 3 weeks after I was brought in to the post, a troop of cavalry came from the south to relieve one of the troops stationed there. There was great jubilation in the encampment after the arrival of the newcomers. Old friendships were renewed and new ones made. But the happiest men were those of the troop that was to be relieved. The next morning they started away, and as they were forced upon the parade ground, we prisoners were marched from our quarters and lined up before them. A couple of long chains were brought, with rings in the links every few feet. At first I could not guess the purpose of these chains, but I was soon to learn. A couple of soldiers snapped the first ring around the neck of a powerful white slave, and one by one the rest of us were herded to our places, and the work of shackling us neck to neck commenced. The colonel stood watching the procedure. Presently his eyes fell upon me, and he spoke to a young officer at his side. The latter stepped toward me and motioned me to follow him. I did so and was led back to the colonel. By this time I could understand a few words of their strange language, and when the colonel asked me if I would prefer to remain at the post as his body servant, I signified my willingness as emphatically as possible. For I had seen enough of the brutality of the common soldiers toward their white slaves to have no desire to start out upon a march of unknown length, chained by the neck, and driven on by the great whips that a score of the soldiers carried to accelerate the speed of their charges. About 300 prisoners who had been housed in 6 prisons at the post marched out of the gates that morning, toward what fate and what future I could not guess. Neither had the poor devils themselves more than the most vague conception of what lay in store for them, except that they were going elsewhere to continue in the slavery that they had known since their capture by their black conquerors, a slavery that was to continue until death released them. My position was altered at the post. From working about the headquarters office, I was transferred to the colonel's living quarters. I had greater freedom and no longer slept in one of the prisons, but had a little room to myself off the kitchen of the colonel's log house. My master was always kind to me, and under him I rapidly learned the language of my captors, and much concerning them that had been a mystery to me before. His name was Abu Balik. He was a colonel in the cavalry of Abyssinia, a country of which I do not remember ever hearing, but which Colonel Balik assured me is the oldest civilized country in the world. Colonel Balik was born in Addis Ababa, the capital of the empire, and until recently had been in command of the Emperor's palace guard. Jealousy and the ambition and intrigue of another officer had lost him the favor of his emperor, and he had been detailed to this frontier post as a mark of his sovereign's displeasure. Some 50 years before, the young emperor Menelik XIV was ambitious. He knew that a great world lay across the waters far to the north of his capital. Once he had crossed the desert and looked out upon the blue sea that was the northern boundary of his dominions. There lay another world to conquer. Menelik busied himself with the building of a great fleet, though his people were not a maritime race. His army crossed into Europe. It met with little resistance, and for 50 years his soldiers had been pushing his boundaries farther and farther toward the north. "The yellow men from the east and north are contesting our rights here now," said the colonel, "but we shall win. We shall conquer the world, carrying Christianity to all the benighted heathen of Europe and Asia as well." "You are a Christian people?" I asked. He looked at me in surprise, nodding his head affirmatively. "I am a Christian," I said. "My people are the most powerful on earth." He smiled and shook his head indulgently, as a father to a child who sets up his childish judgment against that of his elders. Then I set out to prove my point. I told him of our cities, of our army, of our great navy. He came right back at me asking for figures, and when he was done, I had to admit that only in our navy were we numerically superior. Menelik XIV is the undisputed ruler of all the continent of Africa, of all of ancient Europe, except the British Isles, Scandinavia, and Eastern Russia, and has large possessions and prosperous colonies in what once were Arabia and Turkey in Asia. He has a standing army of 10 million men, and his people possess slaves, white slaves, to the number of 10 or 15 million. Colonel Balik was much surprised, however, upon his part, to learn of the great nation which lay across the ocean, and when he found that I was a naval officer, he was inclined to accord me even greater consideration than formerly. It was difficult for him to believe my assertion that there were but few blacks in my country, and that these occupied a lower social plane than the whites. Just the reverse is true in Colonel Balik's land. He considered whites inferior beings, creatures of a lower order, and assured me that even the few white freemen of Abyssinia were never accorded anything approximating a position of social equality with the blacks. They live in the poorer districts of the cities, in little white colonies, and a black who marries a white is socially ostracized. The arms and ammunition of the Abyssinians are greatly inferior to ours, yet they are tremendously effective against the ill-armed barbarians of Europe. Their rifles are of a type similar to the magazine rifles of 20th century Pan America, but carrying only 5 cartridges in the magazine, in addition to the one in the chamber. They are of extraordinary length, even those of the cavalry, and are of extreme accuracy. The Abyssinians themselves are a fine-looking race of black men, tall, muscular, with fine teeth and regular features, which incline distinctly toward Semitic mold. I refer to the full-blooded natives of Abyssinia. They are the patricians, the aristocracy. The army is officered almost exclusively by them. Among the soldiery, a lower type of Negro predominates, with thicker lips and broader, flatter noses. These men are recruited, so the colonel told me, from among the conquered tribes of Africa. They are good soldiers, brave and loyal. They can read and write, and they are endowed with a self-confidence and pride which, from my readings of the words of ancient African explorers, must have been wanting in their earliest progenitors. On the whole, it is apparent that the black race has thrived far better in the past 2 centuries under men of its own color than it had under the domination of whites during all previous history. I had been a prisoner at the little frontier post for over a month, when orders came to Colonel Bullock to hasten to the eastern frontier with the major portion of his command, leaving only 1 troop to garrison the fort. As his body servant, I accompanied him mounted upon a fiery little Abyssinian pony. We marched rapidly for 10 days through the heart of the ancient German Empire, halting when night found us in proximity to water. Often we passed small posts similar to that at which the colonel's regiment had been quartered, finding in each instance that only a single company or troop remained for defense, the balance having been withdrawn toward the northeast in the same direction in which we were moving. Naturally, the colonel had not confided to me the nature of his orders. But the rapidity of our march, and the fact that all available troops were being hastened toward the northeast, assured me that a matter of vital importance to the dominion of Menelik XIV in that part of Europe was threatening or had already broken. I could not believe that a simple rising of the savage tribes of whites would necessitate the mobilizing of such a force, as we presently met with converging from the south into our trail. There were large bodies of cavalry and infantry, endless streams of artillery, wagons, and guns, and countless horse-drawn covered vehicles laden with camp equipage, munitions, and provisions. Here, for the first time, I saw camels, great caravans of them, bearing all sorts of heavy burdens, and miles upon miles of elephants doing similar service. It was a scene of wondrous and barbaric splendor, for the men and beasts from the south were gaily caparisoned in rich colors, in marked contrast to the gray uniformed forces of the frontier, with which I had been familiar. The rumor reached us that Menelik himself was coming, and the pitch of excitement to which this announcement raised the troops was little short of miraculous, at least, to one of my race and nationality, whose rulers for centuries had been but ordinary men, holding office at the will of the people for a few brief years. As I witnessed it, I could not but speculate upon the moral effect upon his troops of a sovereign's presence in the midst of battle. All else being equal in war between the troops of a republic and an empire, could not this exhilarated mental state, amounting almost to hysteria on the part of the imperial troops, weigh heavily against the soldiers of a president? I wonder. But if the emperor chanced to be absent? What then? Again I wonder. On the 11th day, we reached our destination, a walled frontier city of about 20,000. We passed some lakes and crossed some old canals before entering the gates. Within, beside the frame buildings, were many built of ancient brick and well-cut stone. These, I was told, were of material taken from the ruins of the ancient city which, once, had stood upon the site of the present town. The name of the town, translated from the Abyssinian, is New Gondar. It stands, I am convinced, upon the ruins of ancient Berlin, the one-time capital of the old German Empire. But except for the old building material used in the new town, there is no sign of the former city. The day after we arrived, the town was gaily decorated with flags, streamers, gorgeous rugs, and banners, for the rumor had proved true, the emperor was coming. Colonel Bullock had accorded me the greatest liberty, permitting me to go where I pleased, after my few duties had been performed. As a result of his kindness, I spent much time wandering about New Gondar, talking with the inhabitants, and exploring the city of black men. As I had been given a semi-military uniform, which bore insignia indicating that I was an officer's body servant, even the blacks treated me with a species of respect, though I could see by their manner that I was really as the dirt beneath their feet. They answered my questions civilly enough, but they would not enter into conversation with me. It was from other slaves that I learned the gossip of the city. Troops were pouring in from the west and south, and pouring out toward the east. I asked an old slave who was sweeping the dirt into little piles in the gutters of the street where the soldiers were going. He looked at me in surprise. "Why, to fight the yellow men, of course," he said. "They have crossed the border and are marching toward New Gondar." "Who will win?" I asked. He shrugged his shoulders. "Who knows?" he said. "I hope it will be the yellow men, but Menelik is powerful. It will take many yellow men to defeat him." Crowds were gathering along the sidewalks to view the emperor's entry into the city. I took my place among them, although I hate crowds, and I am glad that I did, for I witnessed such a spectacle of barbaric splendor as no other Pan-American has ever looked upon. Down the broad main thoroughfare, which may once have been the historic Unter den Linden, came a brilliant cortege. At the head rode a regiment of red-coated hussars, enormous men, black as night. There were troops of riflemen mounted on camels. The emperor rode in a golden howdah upon the back of a huge elephant so covered with rich hangings and embellished with scintillating gems that scarce more than the beastle's eyes and feet were visible. Menelik was a rather gross-looking man, well past middle age, but he carried himself with an air of dignity befitting one descended in unbroken line from the prophet, as was his claim. His eyes were bright but crafty, and his features denoted both sensuality and cruelness. In his youth, he may have been a rather fine-looking black, but when I saw him, his appearance was revolting, to me at least. Following the emperor came regiment after regiment from the various branches of the service, among them batteries of field guns mounted on elephants. In the center of the troops following the imperial elephant marched a great caravan of slaves. The old street sweeper at my elbow told me that these were the gifts brought in from the far outlying districts by the commanding officers of the frontier posts. The majority of them were women, destined, I was told, for the harems of the emperor and his favorites. It made my old companion clench his fists to see those poor white women marching past to their horrid fates, and though I shared his sentiments, I was as powerless to alter their destinies as he. For a week the troops kept pouring in and out of New Gondar, in, always from the south and west, but always toward the east. Each new contingent brought its gifts to the emperor. From the south they brought rugs and ornaments and jewels, from the west, slaves, for the commanding officers of the western frontier posts had naught else to bring. From the number of women they brought, I judged that they knew the weakness of their imperial master. And then soldiers commenced coming in from the east, but not with the gay assurance of those who came from the south and west. No, these others came in covered wagons, blood-soaked and suffering. They came at first in little parties of 8 or 10, and then they came in 50s, in hundreds, and one day 1,000 maimed and dying men were carted into New Gondar. It was then that Menelik XIV became uneasy. For 50 years, his armies had conquered wherever they had marched. At first he had led them in person. Lately his presence within 100 miles of the battle line had been sufficient for large engagements. For minor ones, only the knowledge that they were fighting for the glory of their sovereign was necessary to win victories. One morning, New Gondar was awakened by the booming of cannon. It was the first intimation that the townspeople had received that the enemy was forcing the imperial troops back upon the city. Dust-covered couriers galloped in from the front. Fresh troops hastened from the city, and about noon Menelik rode out surrounded by his staff. For 3 days thereafter, we could hear the cannonading and the spitting of the small arms, for the battle line was scarce 2 leagues from New Gondar. The city was filled with wounded. Just outside, soldiers were engaged in throwing up earthworks. It was evident to the least enlightened that Menelik expected further reverses. And then the imperial troops fell back upon these new defenses, or rather, they were forced back by the enemy. Shells commenced to fall within the city. Menelik returned and took up his headquarters in the stone building that was called the palace. That night came a lull in the hostilities. A truce had been arranged. Colonel Balik summoned me about 7 o'clock to dress him for a function at the palace. In the midst of death and defeat, the emperor was about to give a great banquet to his officers. I was to accompany my master and wait upon him. I, Jefferson Turck, lieutenant in the Pan-American Navy. In the privacy of the colonel's quarters, I had become accustomed to my menial duties. lightened as they were by the natural kindliness of my master. But the thought of appearing in public as a common slave revolted every fine instinct within me. Yet there was nothing for it but to obey. I cannot, even now, bring myself to a narration of the humiliation which I experienced that night as I stood behind my black master in silent servility, now pouring his wine, now cutting up his meats for him, now fanning him with a large, plumed fan of feathers. As fond as I had grown of him, I could have thrust a knife into him, so keenly did I feel the affront that had been put upon me. But at last the long banquet was concluded. The tables were removed. The emperor ascended a dais at one end of the room and seated himself upon a throne, and the entertainment commenced. It was only what ancient history might have led me to expect: musicians, dancing girls, jugglers, and the like. Near midnight, the master of ceremonies announced that the slave women who had been presented to the emperor since his arrival in New Gondar would be exhibited, that the royal host would select such as he wished, after which he would present the balance of them to his guests. Ah, what royal generosity! A small door at one side of the room opened, and the poor creatures filed in and were ranged in a long line before the throne. Their backs were toward me. I saw only an occasional profile, as now and then a bolder spirit among them turned to survey the apartment and the gorgeous assemblage of officers in their brilliant dress uniforms. They were profiles of young girls, and pretty, but horror was indelibly stamped upon them all. I shuddered as I contemplated their sad fate and turned my eyes away. I heard the master of ceremonies command them to prostrate themselves before the emperor, and the sounds as they went upon their knees before him, touching their foreheads to the floor. Then came the official's voice again, in sharp and peremptory command. "Down, slave," he cried. "Make obeisance to your sovereign." I looked up, attracted by the tone of the manel's voice, to see a single, straight, slim figure standing erect in the center of the line of prostrate girls, her arms folded across her breast and little chin in the air. Her back was toward me. I could not see her face, though I should like to see the countenance of this savage young lioness, standing there defiant among that herd of terrified sheep. "Down! Down!" shouted the master of ceremonies, taking a step toward her and half drawing his sword. My blood boiled. To stand there inactive, while a Negro struck down that brave girl of my own race. Instinctively, I took a forward step to place myself in the manel's path. But at the same instant, Menelik raised his hand in a gesture that halted the officer. The emperor seemed interested, but in no way angered at the girl's attitude. "Let us inquire," he said in a smooth, pleasant voice, "why this young woman refuses to do homage to her sovereign," and he put the question himself directly to her. She answered him in Abyssinian, but brokenly, and with an accent that betrayed how recently she had acquired her slight knowledge of the tongue. "I go on my knees to no one," she said. "I have no sovereign. I myself am sovereign in my own country." Menelik, at her words, leaned back in his throne and laughed uproariously. Following his example, which seemed always the correct procedure, the assembled guests vied with one another in an effort to laugh more noisily than the emperor. The girl but tilted her chin a bit higher in the air. Even her back proclaimed her utter contempt for her captors. Finally, Menelik restored quiet by the simple expedient of a frown, whereupon each loyal guest exchanged his mirthful mien for an emulative scowl. "And who," asked Menelik, "are you, and by what name is your country called?" "I am Victory, Queen of Grabberton," replied the girl so quickly and so unexpectedly that I gasped in astonishment. Chapter 9. Victory. She was here, a slave to these black conquerors. Once more I started toward her, but better judgment held me back. I could do nothing to help her other than by stealth. Could I even accomplish aught by this means? I did not know. It seemed beyond the pale of possibility, and yet I should try. "And you will not bend the knee to me," continued Menelik after she had spoken. Victory shook her head in a most decided negation. "You shall be my first choice then," said the emperor. "I like your spirit, for the breaking of it will add to my pleasure in you, and never fear but that it shall be broken, this very night. Take her to my apartments," and he motioned to an officer at his side. I was surprised to see Victory follow the man off in apparent quiet submission. I tried to follow, that I might be near her against some opportunity to speak with her or assist in her escape. But after I had followed them from the throne room, through several other apartments, and down a long corridor, I found my further progress barred by a soldier who stood guard before a doorway through which the officer conducted Victory. Almost immediately, the officer reappeared and started back in the direction of the throne room. I had been hiding in a doorway after the guard had turned me back, having taken refuge there while his back was turned. And, as the officer approached me, I withdrew into the room beyond, which was in darkness. There I remained for a long time, watching the sentry before the door of the room in which Victory was a prisoner, and awaiting some favorable circumstance which would give me entry to her. I have not attempted to fully describe my sensations at the moment I recognized Victory, because, I can assure you, they were entirely indescribable. I should never have imagined that the sight of any human being could affect me as had this unexpected discovery of Victory in the same room in which I was, while I had thought of her for weeks either as dead or at best hundreds of miles to the west, and as irretrievably lost to me as though she were, in truth, dead. I was filled with a strange, mad impulse to be near her. It was not enough merely to assist her or protect her. I desired to touch her, to take her in my arms. I was astounded at myself. Another thing puzzled me. It was my incomprehensible feeling of elation since I had again seen her. With a fate worse than death staring her in the face, and with the knowledge that I should probably die defending her within the hour, I was still happier than I had been for weeks, and all because I had seen again for a few brief minutes the figure of a little heathen maiden. I couldn't account for it, and it angered me. I had never before felt any such sensations in the presence of a woman, and I had made love to some very beautiful ones in my time. It seemed ages that I stood in the shadow of that doorway, in the ill-lit corridor of the palace of Menelik 14. A sickly gas jet cast a sad pallor upon the black face of the sentry. The fellow seemed rooted to the spot. Evidently he would never leave or turn his back again. I had been in hiding but a short time when I heard the sound of distant cannon. The truce had ended, and the battle had been resumed. Very shortly thereafter the earth shook to the explosion of a shell within the city, and from time to time, thereafter other shells burst at no great distance from the palace. The yellow men were bombarding New Gondar again. Presently officers and slaves commenced to traverse the corridor on matters pertaining to their duties, and then came the emperor, scowling and wrathful. He was followed by a few personal attendants, whom he dismissed at the doorway to his apartments, the same doorway through which Victory had been taken. I chafed to follow him, but the corridor was filled with people. At last they betook themselves to their own apartments, which lay upon either side of the corridor. An officer and a slave entered the very room in which I hid, forcing me to flat myself to one side in the darkness until they had passed. Then the slave made a light, and I knew that I must find another hiding place. Stepping boldly into the corridor, I saw that it was now empty save for the single sentry before the emperor's door. He glanced up as I emerged from the room, the occupants of which had not seen me. I walked straight toward the soldier, my mind made up in an instant. I tried to simulate an expression of cringing servility, and I must have succeeded, for I entirely threw the man off his guard, so that he permitted me to approach within reach of his rifle before stopping me. Then it was too late for him. Without a word or a warning, I snatched the piece from his grasp, and at the same time struck him a terrific blow between the eyes with my clenched fist. He staggered back in surprise, too dumbfounded even to cry out, and then I clubbed his rifle and felled him with a single mighty blow. A moment later, I had burst into the room beyond. It was empty. I gazed about, mad with disappointment. 2 doors opened from this to other rooms. I ran to the nearer and listened. Yes, voices were coming from beyond, and one was a woman's, level and cold and filled with scorn. There was no terror in it. It was Victoriel's. I turned the knob and pushed the door inward, just in time to see Menelik seize the girl and drag her toward the far end of the apartment. At the same instant, there was a deafening roar just outside the palace. A shell had struck much nearer than any of its predecessors. The noise of it drowned my rapid rush across the room. But in her struggles, Victory turned Menelek about so that he saw me. She was striking him in the face with her clenched fist, and now he was choking her. At sight of me, he gave voice to a roar of anger. "What means this, slave?" he cried. "Out of here. Out of here. Quick before I kill you." But for answer I rushed upon him, striking him with the butt of the rifle. He staggered back, dropping Victory to the floor, and then he cried aloud for the guard and came at me. Again and again I struck him, but his thick skull might have been armor plate for all the damage I did it. He tried to close with me, seizing the rifle, but I was stronger than he, and, wrenching the weapon from his grasp, tossed it aside and made for his throat with my bare hands. I had not dared fire the weapon for fear that its report would bring the larger guard stationed at the farther end of the corridor. We struggled about the room, striking one another, knocking over furniture, and rolling upon the floor. Menelek was a powerful man, and he was fighting for his life. Continually he kept calling for the guard, until I succeeded in getting a grip upon his throat, but it was too late. His cries had been heard, and suddenly the door burst open, and a score of armed guardsmen rushed into the apartment. Victory seized the rifle from the floor and leaped between me and them. I had the Black Emperor upon his back, and both my hands were at his throat, choking the life from him. The rest happened in the fraction of a second. There was a rending crash above us, then a deafening explosion within the chamber. Smoke and powder fumes filled the room. Half stunned, I rose from the lifeless body of my antagonist, just in time to see Victory stagger to her feet and turn toward me. Slowly, the smoke cleared to reveal the shattered remnants of the guard. A shell had fallen through the palace roof and exploded just in the rear of the detachment of guardsmen who were coming to the rescue of their emperor. Why neither Victory nor I were struck is a miracle. The room was a wreck. A great, jagged hole was torn in the ceiling, and the wall toward the corridor had been blown entirely out. As I rose, Victory had risen too and started toward me. But when she saw that I was uninjured, she stopped and stood there in the center of the demolished apartment looking at me. Her expression was inscrutable. I could not guess whether she was glad to see me or not. "Victory," I cried. "Thank God that you are safe." And I approached her, a greater gladness in my heart than I had felt since the moment that I knew the Coldwater must be swept beyond 30. There was no answering gladness in her eyes. Instead, she stamped her little foot in anger. "Why did it have to be you who saved me?" she exclaimed. "I hate you." "Hate me?" I asked. "Why should you hate me, Victory?" "I do not hate you." What was I about to say? I was very close to her as a great light broke over me. Why had I never realized it before? The truth accounted for a great many hitherto inexplicable moods that had claimed me from time to time since first I had seen Victory. "Why should I hate you?" she repeated. "Because Snyder told me. He told me that you had promised me to him, but he did not get me. I killed him as I should like to kill you." "Snyder lied," I cried. And then I seized her and held her in my arms and made her listen to me, though she struggled and fought like a young lioness. "I love you, Victory. You must know that I love you, that I have always loved you, and that I never could have made so base a promise." She ceased her struggles, just a trifle, but still tried to push me from her. "You called me a barbarian," she said. Ah, so that was it. That still rankled. I crushed her to me. "You could not love a barbarian," she went on, but she had ceased to struggle. "But I do love a barbarian, Victory," I cried, "the dearest barbarian in the world." She raised her eyes to mine, and then her smooth, brown arms encircled my neck and drew my lips down to hers. "I love you, I have loved you always," she said, and then she buried her face upon my shoulder and sobbed. "I have been so unhappy," she said, "but I could not die while I thought that you might live." As we stood there, momentarily forgetful of all else than our new-found happiness, the ferocity of the bombardment increased until scarce 30 seconds elapsed between the shells that rained about the palace. To remain long would be to invite certain death. We could not escape the way that we had entered the apartment, for not only was the corridor now choked with debris, but beyond the corridor there were doubtless many members of the Emperor's household who would stop us. Upon the opposite side of the room was another door, and toward this I led the way. It opened into a third apartment with windows overlooking an inner court. From one of these windows, I surveyed the courtyard. Apparently it was empty, and the rooms upon the opposite side were unlighted. Assisting Victory to the open, I followed, and together we crossed the court, discovering upon the opposite side a number of wide wooden doors set in the wall of the palace, with small windows between. As we stood close behind one of the doors, listening, a horse within neighed. "The stables," I whispered, and a moment later had pushed back a door and entered. From the city about us, we could hear the din of great commotion, and quite close the sounds of battle. The crack of thousands of rifles, the yells of the soldiers, the hoarse commands of officers, and the blare of bugles. The bombardment had ceased as suddenly as it had commenced. I judged that the enemy was storming the city, for the sounds we heard were the sounds of hand-to-hand combat. Within the stables, I groped about until I had found saddles and bridles for 2 horses. But afterward, in the darkness, I could find but a single mount. The doors of the opposite side, leading to the street, were open, and we could see great multitudes of men, women, and children fleeing toward the west. Soldiers, afoot and mounted, were joining the mad exodus. Now and then a camel or an elephant would pass bearing some officer or dignitary to safety. It was evident that the city would fall at any moment, a fact which was amply proclaimed by the terror-stricken haste of the fear-mad mob. Horse, camel, and elephant trod helpless women and children beneath their feet. A common soldier dragged a general from his mount, and, leaping to the animal's back, fled down the packed street toward the west. A woman seized a gun and brained a court dignitary, whose horse had trampled her child to death. Shrieks, curses, commands, supplications filled the air. It was a frightful scene, one that will be burned upon my memory forever. I had saddled and bridled the single horse which had evidently been overlooked by the royal household in its flight, and, standing a little back in the shadow of the stable's interior, Victory and I watched the surging throng without. To have entered, it would have been to have courted greater danger than we were already in. We decided to wait until the stress of blacks thinned, and for more than an hour we stood there while the sounds of battle raged upon the eastern side of the city and the population flew toward the west. More and more numerous became the uniformed soldiers among the fleeing throng, until, toward the last, the street was packed with them. It was no orderly retreat, but a rout complete and terrible. The fighting was steadily approaching us now, until the crack of rifles sounded in the very street upon which we were looking. And then came a handful of brave men, a little rear guard backing slowly toward the west, working their smoking rifles in feverish haste as they fired volley after volley at the foe we could not see. But these were pressed back and back until the first line of the enemy came opposite our shelter. They were men of medium height, with olive complexions and almond eyes. In them, I recognized the descendants of the ancient Chinese race. They were well uniformed and superbly armed, and they fought bravely and under perfect discipline. So wrapped was I in the exciting events transpiring in the street that I did not hear the approach of a body of men from behind. It was a party of the conquerors who had entered the palace and were searching it. They came upon us so unexpectedly that we were prisoners before we realized what had happened. That night we were held under a strong guard just outside the eastern wall of the city, and the next morning were started upon a long march toward the east. Our captors were not unkind to us and treated the women prisoners with respect. We marched for many days, so many that I lost count of them, and at last we came to another city, a Chinese city this time, which stands upon the site of ancient Moscow. It is only a small frontier city, but it is well built and well kept. Here a large military force is maintained, and here also is a terminus of the railroad that crosses modern China to the Pacific. There was every evidence of a high civilization in all that we saw within the city, which, in connection with the humane treatment that had been accorded all prisoners upon the long and tiresome march, encouraged me to hope that I might appeal to some high officer here for the treatment which my rank and birth merited. We could converse with our captors only through the medium of interpreters, who spoke both Chinese and Abyssinian. But there were many of these, and shortly after we reached the city, I persuaded one of them to carry a verbal message to the officer who had commanded the troops during the return from New Gondar, asking that I might be given a hearing by some high official. The reply to my request was a summons to appear before the officer to whom I had addressed my appeal. A sergeant came for me along with the interpreter, and I managed to obtain his permission to let Victory accompany me. I had never left her alone with the prisoners since we had been captured. To my delight, I found that the officer into whose presence we were conducted spoke Abyssinian fluently. He was astounded when I told him that I was a Pan American. Unlike all others whom I had spoken with since my arrival in Europe, he was well acquainted with ancient history, was familiar with 20th century conditions in Pan America, and after putting a half-dozen questions to me, was satisfied that I spoke the truth. When I told him that Victory was Queen of England, he showed little surprise, telling me that in their recent explorations in ancient Russia, they had found many descendants of the old nobility and royalty. He immediately set aside a comfortable house for us, furnished us with servants and with money, and in other ways showed us every attention and kindness. He told me that he would telegraph his emperor at once, and the result was that we were presently commanded to repair to Peking and present ourselves before the ruler. We made the journey in a comfortable railway carriage, through a country which, as we traveled farther toward the east, showed increasing evidence of prosperity and wealth. At the imperial court, we were received with great kindness, the emperor being most inquisitive about the state of modern Pan America. He told me that while he personally deplored the existence of the strict regulations which had raised a barrier between the East and the West, he had felt, as had his predecessors, that recognition of the wishes of the great Pan American Federation would be most conducive to the continued peace of the world. His empire includes all of Asia, and the islands of the Pacific as far east as 175 degrees W. The Empire of Japan no longer exists, having been conquered and absorbed by China over 100 years ago. The Philippines are well administered and constitute one of the most progressive colonies of the Chinese Empire. The emperor told me that the building of this great empire and the spreading of enlightenment among its diversified and savage peoples had required all the best efforts of nearly 200 years. Upon his accession to the throne, he had found the labor well-nigh perfected and had turned his attention to the reclamation of Europe. His ambition is to wrest it from the hands of the blacks, and then to attempt the work of elevating its fallen peoples to the high estate from which the Great War precipitated them. I asked him who was victorious in that war, and he shook his head sadly as he replied. Pan America, perhaps in China, with the blacks of Abyssinia, he said. Those who did not fight were the only ones to reap any of the rewards that are supposed to belong to victory. The combatants reaped naught but annihilation. You have seen, better than any man you must realize that there was no victory for any nation embroiled in that frightful war. When did it end? I asked him. Again he shook his head. It has not ended yet. There has never been a formal peace declared in Europe. After a while, there were none left to make peace, and the rude tribes which sprang from the survivors continued to fight among themselves because they knew no better condition of society. War raised the works of man, war and pestilence raised man. God give that there shall never be such another war. You all know how Porfirio Johnson returned to Pan America with John Alvarez in chains. How Alvarez's trial raised a popular demonstration that the government could not ignore. His eloquent appeal, not for himself but for me, is historic, as are its results. You know how a fleet was sent across the Atlantic to search for me, how the restrictions against crossing 30 to 175 were removed forever, and how the officers were brought to Peking, arriving upon the very day that Victory and I were married at the imperial court. My return to Pan America was very different from anything I could possibly have imagined a year before. Instead of being received as a traitor to my country, I was acclaimed a hero. It was good to get back again, good to witness the kindly treatment that was accorded my dear Victory, and when I learned that Delcart and Taylor had been found at the mouth of the Rhine and were already back in Pan America, my joy was unalloyed. And now we are going back, Victory and I, with the men and the munitions and power to reclaim England for her queen. Again I shall cross 30, but under what altered conditions? A new epoch for Europe is inaugurated, with enlightened China on the east and enlightened Pan America on the west, the two great peace powers whom God has preserved to regenerate chastened and forgiven Europe. I have been through much, I have suffered much, but I have won two great laurel wreaths beyond 30. One is the opportunity to rescue Europe from barbarism, the other is a little barbarian, and the greater of these is victory. End of the Project Gutenberg ebook of The Lost Continent by Edgar Rice Burroughs.